Thank you, Jaron. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be back here. I've wandered around from church to church. It seems like really kind of for the past couple months, just filling in. And it really is nice seeing a bunch of different people. They don't know who I am, so they tend to let me in a little easier than around here. But no, so it's always nice going to other churches, nice help, and just kind of seeing what everybody else does. Well, I'll tell you. And nothing bad. I'm not saying anything badly about these other places, but it doesn't have the same feel as here. There's really something special, really something enjoyable about being here. I certainly love all of you dearly, and thanks, Pastor Ben, for allowing me. And hopefully, it sounds like he had a little bit of time off, but he was a little sickly, so definitely a good time for him. So. Really enjoyed that last song that we sang. We're talking about being our vision. You know, we've got a 2024 coming up. Like, how's that looking? When I was surveying this time of the year, I always dreaded this. You know, you get done with Christmas, and then you have New Year's, and then after New Year's, you just kind of have like nothing for the next few months. Like, it's always gray outside, just kind of wet, slimy, just, you're cold. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of miserable. So this time of the year, I always look to with dread. But this year's going to be different, all right? So let's focus differently on what we're looking about, how we're going to be proceeding into this year. So I want to start, definitely going to be talking today about spiritual distractions. Like, this year, 2024, we're going to be looking at some distractions, right? Like, there's some things coming down. But if we're going to be distracted, we have to know what we're being distracted from. So the goal of a Christian, this is something every morning we wake up, this needs to be our goal. Our goal needs to be knowing God, and it needs to be making Him known, right? Like, we wake up, we get out of bed, our job is to know God more, to fall more in love with Him, and then we need to be making Him known. Jesus said in John 17, verse 3, says, "This is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent." So this is what we're saying. This is where we as Christians, we as professing Christians, need to know God. The second thing that we need to be doing here, we need to be making Him known. That obviously comes from Christ's directive with the Great Commission. Matthew 28, verse 19, where Jesus says, "Go and make disciples of all nations," right? So we're knowing God and we're making Him known. This is an everyday mentality. This is an every situation mentality. This is every interaction. The Christian goal is to know God and to make Him known. But then what happens? Along come distractions, right? Like, problem with distractions is that whenever Christians get distractions or get distracted, we start making mistakes, right? Like, we start getting really, really bogged down. And sin, this mentality of knowing God and making Him known just really becomes forgotten on our end. And then the problem here is that when we start getting bogged down on sin, the local church starts to suffer, right? And when the local church starts to suffer, then communities and then churches inside those communities begin to suffer. But the problem is distractions are just a fact of life, right? Like, this is something we're going to have to deal with every single day. And most of you are probably going to be starting back to work again on Tuesday, right? Alarm clock's going to go off. Yay, just had our week of not doing anything. Alarm clock goes off, time to wake up. Oh, how exciting, huh? Like, you're going to have to jump in the car. You're going to have to head some direction, probably sit in traffic. Once you get to work, like, you're paying for taking time off because you have all those emails you're going to have to go back through and answer, right? So you're going to have to be answering all those emails. You're going to be talking to a ton of people, and then the phone's going to be ringing. Like, you're going to try and get work done, but Tuesday's probably not going to be a terribly productive day, right? Like, it's going to be a matter of just kind of maintaining your existence at the office is really just kind of what that is. Then you're going to go home. Well, you've been home, or you've been away the first day, and in a week or so, the wife and kids, they're having their own issues. The kids, not that might do this, but hey, Dad's gone. All this pent up frustration that we've had. Like I said, my children don't do that, but it's hey, Dad's away, Mom's away. You kind of reworking the kinks out again, right? All of this is throwing our attention away from the Lord. Like, all of these things are going to be distractions to us, and through all of that, we're going to have to stay focused on the Lord. Again, 2024, can we think of one distraction in 2024? Just name one off that giant list, right? Like we've got elections in America that's coming up. That's going to be a distraction. The UK is also having elections as well. So with these wonderful elections we get to deal with, we get to have the golden calf of global warming shoved down our throats. They're going to be telling us how rotten people we are for staying cool in the summertime and warm in the wintertime. And we're going to hear how we need to vote for the person that's going to stop the destruction of the earth. Oh, fun thing as well with the elections is that also means that workplaces are going to be slow to hire. So if you're looking for a new job, definitely have fun with that. They're going to be slow to hire because they don't know what the economy is going to be looking like. But then we also begin to run back into that product shortage time. Remember the whole dreadful product shortage, where we couldn't even find enough toilet paper around here. It was all because of COVID. Hey, guess what we get to be running into here in 2024 as well? They're saying that 2024 is going to be producing more time of us using AI. So it's going to be less human interaction and more interaction with robots. Like, I don't know if you guys have called a robot recently and had a conversation with them. It's not getting better. It's supposed to. It certainly is not. And then they're saying, okay, well, digital currency is really going to start swinging in. So that's all fun and exciting. So that means the money in my bank, I have to trust somebody else to convert over into digital currency. Like, I just not real comfortable with that one. But so we start thinking, okay, as a Christian, just the stress that this causes, just the worry that this causes us to have, we end up losing sight of God in all of this stuff, right? And what truly happens is we forget our mission. We forget what the goal of a Christian is supposed to be. You guys remember back in 2003, the Abu Ghraib in Iraq when this happened. So remember, it was an American prison. We captured a bunch of Iraqi prisoners. We captured a bunch of Iraqi prisoners, and our people were kind of doing some pretty mean, some kind of sick stuff to them. Like they were torturing these people. And so they go through and they punish all these American soldiers for all these war crimes, and come to find out what really caused this was they lost sight of the mission. Right? They became distracted. They lost sight of the mission. Once that happens, we start losing control. So this is what I really want for us to do today. Okay, this is what everybody's coming here for. Okay, so the purpose of today, and I want all of us really in here to just start purposing in our hearts today that we need to be aware of distractions, okay? We need to be aware of these distractions. We need to follow the Lord in these convictions. Then we need to begin ridding our hearts of them. So the rest of the time here, I'm going to be talking about 3 specific distractions that cause many in the local church to become ineffective for the Lord, okay? Large list of distractions that are out there. These really just tend to seem to be the most common ones that are out there. And again, the whole point of this is when we become distracted from God, we are no longer being effective. We lose sight of the goal. The goal is that we need to be knowing God and we need to be making Him known. But before we get into it, shall we pray? Bow your heads, please. God, we thank you so much for this time, God. We thank you for this institution, God, this local church that you've set up as a place for us to come and just get away from the world, God, get away from the pains of the world, get away from the stresses of the world, God, and just sit and enjoy the comfort of you, God. We asked during this time of instruction, God, that our hearts are pierced with the truth, God, and that we see the severity if there's changes that we need to be making, God, that we see the willingness to change them. If there are areas in our life where we see that we're doing well, God, I ask that we get comfort from them, God. We love you, we praise you, and we thank you for everything that you're doing for us. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So we're going to be jumping around here a little bit today, not physically, all right? So calm down. We're going to be jumping around. So we're going to be just kind of bouncing around a couple different places in the Bible. And I thought maybe we should start the year off doing sword drills. You guys remember doing that? Remember, where someone would call out, let's go to Luke chapter 10, verse 17. You thumb through the Bible really quickly, and whoever finds it, you just jump up and start reading. But I thought this is probably going to be a bad idea. We're going to be blowing out hips and knees left and right. So we're not going to do that, all right? So we're just going to stick with the standard format, all right? So no need to stress. So Luke chapter 10 is where we're going to be. Like I said, we're just going to kind of be making our way slowly through some of this stuff. But Luke chapter 10, I'll give you guys a few seconds to get there, and I'm going to be talking in the meantime. If you guys are familiar with this part of Luke chapter 10, he starts off with Jesus anointing 70 individuals, 70 apostles, 70 disciples, to go out and start working for him. Some versions of the Bible say that Jesus anointed 72 people. 70, 72, it really makes no impact on this account. So my version, I'm using NASB 1995. It says 70 people, so that's what we're sticking with. So Jesus sends out 70 individuals. The book of Matthew says right before he sends out these 70 individuals, Jesus makes the statement. He says that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So Jesus anoints the people that he needs to, and he sends them in pairs. He sends them out to cities that he is going to visit on down the road. Well, verse 4 in Luke chapter 10, it says that Jesus gives them a packing list. Jesus says, carry no money belt, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one along the way. Okay, so Jesus looks at these 70 individuals, and he says, hey, take just the clothes that are on your back. Don't stop and talk to anyone. Go straight to these cities that I'm sending you to. Verses 8 through 11 in Luke chapter 10. Jesus gives them the directive on what to do while they were there. Okay, so Jesus says, hey, go into the city, and if they receive you, great, work with them. Okay, eat the food that they're offering you and begin to heal them. Jesus says, if they reject you, you need to kick the dust off of your feet and you need to leave. Pretty easy instructions, right? There's nothing terribly difficult about that. Jesus starts off, harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Take nothing with you, but whatever you are wearing. Then once you go to that city, if they receive you, heal them and eat with them. If they reject you, kick the dust off your sandals and leave. So from that account, a lot of times we look at, or we hear the chatter from this chapter, from Luke chapter 10. It ends up turning into a debate-style chapter. It's people like to stand around and talk and say, well, do modern Christians have those gifts anymore? Those gifts of healing and trampling scorpions and snakes and everything, or did they lose it? If they lost it, they lose it in Acts. And I find it very interesting that we focus on the special gifts, we focus on these spiritual gifts like those 70 did as well. Look with me, verse chapter 17 in Luke chapter 10. It says, now the 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like lightning. 19, behold, I have given you authority to walk on snakes and scorpions, and authority over all the powers of the enemy, and nothing will injure you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. Folks, I think this really would have been a very, very interesting time to just be standing around and watching, right? So these 70 disciples, they come back, and they're returning with joy. And it says there in verse 17 that they started talking with Jesus. And they're standing around, they're like, Jesus, did you see what we did? Did you see everything that we did out there? And just, again, really fascinating time to be around. And Jesus says there, yeah, guys, I saw, and you know what I saw? I saw even Satan falling from heaven like lightning. And then he reminds the 70, hey, guys, look, I gave you authority to do many great things, right? It's exactly what he says. He says, you guys can walk on snakes. You guys can walk on scorpions. I've given you the authority over all these satanic forces. And if you imagine that with me, can you imagine right now if we had those specific gifts that they had? We probably wouldn't be sitting in here right now, would we? We'd be mad dash to the hospitals, we're healing people left and right. We'd be casting out demons. We're hitting up street corners, trying to find the demon-possessed individuals. We would be out there lighting the world on fire for Christ, right? But we would be working ourselves like crazy. So if this clicker's working, is it not? Hey, it's not working. Yeah, nah, hey, maybe there it is. Leave it to the new guy to mess it up, huh? No, so to our first point that we're going to be making, this is something I want us all to be mindful of. This first distraction that we are going to be encountering, this first distraction that we're going to be talking about are our spiritual gifts, okay? Kind of weird. Stick with me on this one, though. Verse 20. Again, back in Luke chapter 10, verse 20, Jesus says, "Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this." Again, talking to these 70 individuals. Jesus says, "Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven." So Jesus looks at them and he says, "Hey guys, glad you're doing all these great things. Glad you're doing all these wonderful things. Good, I'm glad you're doing well." To the point where Jesus is like, "Yeah, you guys are doing so great. I even saw Satan fall from the heavens." Jesus is all kinds of excited. But then he's saying, don't rejoice that the spirits are subject to you. Like, what? Why not? Like, this is something we're all kind of interested in, right? Like, this is a really neat thing. But Jesus looks at them and he says, "Rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven." Take a second and just process that. All these wonderful gifts that they had, and Jesus says, that's interesting. The joy should come from the fact that your name is recorded in heaven. All the authority that they had, Jesus says, no, it's not what they're in this for. Question I have very simply for you, is that something that you do? Like, is this something that we have? Do we have more joy over the fact that our names are recorded in heaven? Or do we have more joy in our spiritual gifts and our spiritual talents? You know, I think there's a lot of times in churches where we all just want something to do, right? We want to be serving the Lord, and that's certainly a good thing. You know, we have these gifts that we've been given, and we want to do spiritual work with these gifts. But for some people, it begins to be one of those things where we just kind of want to show off these spiritual gifts that we have. And I'm not discouraging people, okay? I'm not discouraging spiritual work. I'm not discouraging the use of your spiritual gifts. We need to understand that, okay? There's certainly a time and a place for them, but don't get distracted by your spiritual gifts, okay? Do not forget who you are serving. James chapter 2, verse 26, James says, "Faith without works is dead," okay? So there certainly is an aspect to Christians working and using our gifts. It's certainly important. Again, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying don't sit around, don't use your gifts. I'm not saying don't sit around and use your talents that the Lord is giving you. What I'm saying is don't forget who you are working for. Don't forget who our gifts need to be glorifying. You know, and the reality is Christian work can just really kind of be difficult, right? Like, spiritually, it takes its toll on you. Mentally, it takes its toll on you. Physically, like this stuff can really be exhausting. And I'm going to jump down a little rabbit trail here, but you know, talking about spiritual gifts. There's some people, and I'm not necessarily saying here, but there's some people who think that their spiritual gift is complaining, right? Like, there's some people who are just thoroughly convinced my spiritual gift is telling you how you are wrong. And certainly I agree, you know, if the complaint is like heretical error or sinful acts, yes, certainly these need to be corrected because it's pulling our eyes off the goal. But the reality is there's just some things that really don't need to be said, right? Like, we don't have to say the first thing that comes into our mind. This was something that Paul was dealing with in the church of Ephesus. He says there in Ephesians 4, verse 29, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear." This verse seems like this is one of the fewer ones on down that chain, right? Like, we tend to kind of forget about this. You know, there's times complaints are voiced, and again, not here. But you know, there's times that I've heard stories of complaints being voiced, and you know, you just kind of stand around thinking, well, if that's really all they're complaining about, like, I'd say, hey, we're doing great, right? Like, that's the biggest problem we're dealing with. Great, like we're doing well, and I'm certainly not saying I don't want to hear complaints. Okay, this certainly, if there's a problem, let's talk about it, let's get it fixed, right? Like that's the biblical solution to this stuff. So I'm not trying to discourage anyone, you know, from issues that they have. And there's times like these, like we want to use the gifts that we have or gifts that we think we have, and we just want to use them so badly, right? We're standing over in the corner, we're saying, pick me, pick me, pick me. And we begin to get just a little forceful with them, right? You know, there's people who have heard a number of different stories. I'm sure most of you have heard stories of these as well, who they kind of get a little angry because their gifts aren't being utilized in the church, right? Or they think, well, you know, you're not utilizing me how I need to be utilized, and there's a very serious problem. But the problem with that is that's a very prideful stance. That is a very prideful stance for people to be having. Maybe that's why people like that aren't being used. Maybe the problem is that pride is just running so rampant in your life that you're just not being utilized. But using your spiritual gifts is certainly a wonderful thing, okay? Again, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from using them, okay? It's certainly a joy. There's a number of different times while being here where people have walked up to me and just out of the blue, sometimes I've kind of been praying about, wondering about, like, you know, hey, need someone to fill this position. You know, someone comes up and is like, hey, you know, my spiritual gift tends to be scrubbing toilets, so is that something you need help with? And it's like, yes, actually, you know, I was just praying about this, you know, how to go about that. And it's certainly a joyful time. There's a lot of people in and out of these doors. We have a number of different people in here. I'm thoroughly convinced with many gifts, many spiritual talents. We just need to be careful. We need to be careful of them. Remember, our worth does not come from the gifts that we do or do not have. Okay, our spiritual value comes from the fact that our name is recorded in heaven. Don't get distracted by your spiritual gifts and talents. Okay, listen to what Christ says. Christ says, rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. Okay, this should be a glorious thing. Service to the Lord should just be a glorious outpouring of joy. This flows from our heart because we love God so much. We're willing to be used by Him. Remember that. Remember who you are working for when it comes to using your gifts. The second distraction that we need to be mindful of here is our preference. Okay, the reality is we're creatures of comfort, right? Like, my car is more comfortable than the mattress I sleep on every night, right? Like, they can just do so much. We're to the point now where cars, like, we kind of forget that they're just meant to get us from point A to B and then, you know, back again. Like, they can do everything. You look at cell phones as well. Like, the fact that you can make a phone call on a cell phone is just a complete afterthought, right? Like, it's one of those things, you get a new cell phone, you're looking at it, can do all these crazy things, and it's like, yeah, and then buried somewhere underneath here, I can make a phone call. I don't know exactly know how. But the reality is, like, we like our comfort zone, right? We're not a real big fan of being pushed out of our comfort zone. But the problem is it's not what we're called to do, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is where we're going to be next. Go ahead and turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. They had some very serious issues. You have to understand that the town of Corinth, it was a highly trafficked town, a lot of people in and out. So with that comes a lot of the world entering into the church. The church had many issues, and the church was not breaking from the culture like they should have been. So Paul writes this letter to them. He says, hey guys, you need to change, okay? You need to go about things differently. And we get to this point in the letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, specifically verse 19. We get to this point in the letter where Paul starts talking about the freedom, where Paul says, hey guys, look, remember, we're not subject to men, we are subject to God. Okay, so we don't have to be pleasing people, we're pleasing God. We're working to please God. Okay, so a lot of us could step back and we can look and say, well, I guess that just completely gives us the freedom to do whatever it is that we want. But Paul says, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So look with me, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. Paul says, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all so that I may win more. Verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without laws as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means saved. Some, verse 23, I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it all. So Paul says, hey, men are not in charge of me, right? Starts out verse 19. Though I am free from all men, men are not in charge of me. Okay, but I am a slave to them for the sake of the gospel. Okay, so Paul says there in verse 22 that I've become all things for all men. Verse 23 kind of sums it all up again. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Paul says, guys, we have zero time for personal preference here. Like we have absolutely no time for personal preference here. The only personal preference that we have is that the gospel is being preached, okay? That the gospel is being preached. As long as the gospel is being preached in the world, as long as the gospel is being preached in churches, that box is checked, we're moving on, right? How hard is this one? I hope I'm not the only one kind of standing on a little island here myself. Like, this one's hard, right? Like, this is, when you go through and you put together a sermon, like you're getting convicted the whole time. And I kind of got to this one. I was like, let's find another thing to write about. Let's find another thing to do that. But essentially, like what we're doing here is we're surrendering control. Right? Like we are no longer selfish. We can't do anything for us. We are doing them strictly for God. We are doing things strictly for the sake of the gospel. Again, we go back to, hey, what's the goal of a Christian? The goal of a Christian is to know God and to make him known, right? So that means that we lay down our preferences for the sake of spreading the gospel. Reality is that the goal of the local church is meant to equip Christians, right? It's to assist them, it's to assist us in knowing God and making him known. So that means, unfortunately, in the church, we're out of our comfort zone, right? Like things are a little out of our control. And all of us, I'm sure we can prefer things to be done in a certain way, but that's just not biblical. We need to be willing to be a bit uncomfortable, or we at least need to be willing to surrender some control. And again, the overarching theme here, the whole reason we are doing this is so that we are not hindering the spread of the gospel. Now, I get it. You're probably saying, hey, Kyle, you've been away for a little while. No need for you to come back and be a royal jerk. And I get that. I probably am coming off a bit that way, and I'm certainly not intending to be, okay? The problem is that we all have sin to deal with, right? Like, all of us have at one point in our time brought the sin that we are struggling with into this church. But the Bible says that we need to put to death the deeds of the flesh, okay? The reality is we like being selfish, or I guess maybe I'll speak for myself. I enjoy being selfish, okay? There's some Christians inside of churches who just try to make things about themselves, okay? We really like being considered valuable in the church. We like being considered a valuable asset inside of the church. We want recognition for what we think are certainly good deeds, but the problem is, like, that's not what any of this is about, right? Like, we need to be doing things. Paul's saying here, we need to be doing things for the sake of the gospel. This is where we become all things to all men. We need to live to a certain standard. That's certainly very true, okay? Becoming all things to all people doesn't mean, hey, we go ahead and put a bar out back because we're reaching more people. Not what that means. That means we're filtering, we are discerning, we are deciphering. All these decisions that we are making for the sake of the gospel, we are running them through the Bible. What we do is we preach the gospel. We give up our preferences for the sake of the gospel. Again, this one's not very fun. I don't like dealing with this one. I don't like how it makes me feel, to be honest with you, but we're here. Like, we have to deal with this. And there's sometimes this topic causes huge issues inside of a church, right? Like, I know I'm not the only person that has heard stories of people splitting of, hey, we got to change the paint in the lobby. Well, what do you mean change the paint in the lobby? Great such and such. They were the one who picked that beautiful shade of pink. Maybe around here, maybe for the sake of spreading the gospel, maybe we do need to change the paint. Let's leave that on the table. Maybe for the sake of spreading the gospel, maybe for the sake of not hindering the gospel, maybe we do need to change up songs from time to time. Maybe for the sake of spreading the gospel, maybe we need to change up our dress. Maybe some of us need to wear a camel hair in our leather belt and dress like John the Baptist. Maybe that's what we need to do in order to be effective at spreading the gospel. Maybe there's some things that we need to change on the outside, right? Like maybe we need to get rid of the big play set. I'm joking. My children would be angry with me, but like maybe there's some things that we need to do like that. Or maybe just in general, maybe we just need to drop traditional church activities because they aren't gospel spreading activities. We need to be open to things like these. We need to be willing. And that's not, this isn't me saying, okay, now this is what we're going to start doing. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is our hearts need to be willing to give up whatever it is that we need to give up in order to spread the gospel. That's what this is about. Again, I get it. It's kind of a big topic, kind of a double-edged sword here. And these are one of these things, like we can hypothetical this all day long, right? Like we can come up with some sort of what-if scenario, sitting and thinking, hey, I'm going to prove why my preference is right. So, hey, Kyle, what if, what if I have a preference as to why we need to wear certain clothes? Reality is, like, if it's not a biblical directive and it's just your preference, you really need to be prayerfully considering if you are hindering the gospel or not. End of verse 12 in chapter 9 here, Paul says that we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Is that something you can truly say? Is that something that you're willing to say? Is this something you're even willing to set your sights on? Are you willing to endure all things? And notice what Paul does not say here. Paul doesn't say, hey, I'm willing to endure some things. No, Paul says all things. We start thinking about what are all things? Well, that's everything, right? Like Paul is saying, I'm willing to endure all things, but again, why? To not be a hindrance to the gospel. Again, not about us. This is strictly about the Lord. So can you say that you're willing to endure all things? Can you say that you're willing to endure all things and that you're willing to be aware of your preferences and you're willing to realize that your preferences can cause distractions? The third and final distraction here is we need to be mindful of the fear of trials. Okay? I think the reality is, talking about trials, it's like the second least liked topic in church. I think tithing number one, and then trials are next, right? Like not a real big fan of talking about that. But the reality is like we don't like thinking about problems that we will be dealing with, right? Like I think the fear of trials really causes a lot of issues inside of us, and I think a number of issues that it causes inside of us is it causes us to be ineffective. It causes us to not want to work for the Lord. It causes us to not grow in the Lord. But I think there's a certain aspect of these fear of trials to where it's like we're almost sitting around and just waiting for something bad to happen, right? Well, Matthew chapter 14 is where we're going to be. And then go ahead and stick your thumb there in James chapter 1, because we're going to flip over to that. But Matthew chapter 14 is where we're going to be starting. So if we're familiar with the book of Matthew, we're talking about, this is the account of Jesus walking on the waters. So this account, this Jesus walking on the waters, coming hot off the heels of Jesus feeding 5,000 people. Remember that story, Jesus feeding the 5,000 people? Jesus is up, he's addressing a number of different people. And disciples come up to him and they're like, hey, Jesus, people out there are really starting to get hungry. What are we going to do? Jesus says, go out, find the food that they have, bring it back, and we'll feed them. Well, so they bring it back, but they only bring back 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? So Jesus performs this extraordinary miracle, and he creates enough food to feed over 5,000 people, plus there's some extra. So it's just absolutely mind-boggling how Christ does it, but this is what he does. So we get to Matthew 14, verse 22. We look there, it talks about that Jesus sends the disciples away. He sends them in a boat and he tells them to take off. I'm going to meet you over on the other side. So the disciples just get done witnessing Jesus turning 5 loaves and 2 fish into a meal for over 5,000 people. Verse 22, Jesus sends them in a boat and he says, hey, jump in, head off to the other side. Jesus says, I'm going to meet you guys over on the other side. Verse 24, the boat gets a long way into the sea. So a storm pops up. Naturally, they didn't have radar or anything back then, so it's not like they knew that there was going to be this storm out there. So this boat starts getting beat up. And really, the Bible talks about this is a pretty terrifying time for the disciples, and I get it. My last deployment. I was on a ship, and we went through some not very fun storms. So I get the fear. Like I get what these people are thinking about. You feel so helpless. You feel like you have absolutely no control over anything here, and it really truly is quite an awful feeling. So I certainly do understand what the disciples are going through. Verse 25 in Matthew chapter 14, it says that Jesus came walking to them on the sea. Okay, so Jesus was walking on the water towards them. Verse 26, they see Jesus, and they scream because they think it's a ghost, right? Okay, they get this fear and confusion. And, I guess we kind of have to be a little understanding of that, because at this point in time, they were completely unaware that somebody could have been walking on water. Like, we can read the Bible, we understand it's a possibility, it's something the Lord can certainly do. But this was just like, they got to explain something. In verse 27, Jesus looks at them and he says, "Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid." So then what happens, verse 28 and 30, this bold and sometimes arrogant Peter, he does what Peter does. What's he do? He jumps out of his boat and he starts walking on the water towards Jesus, right? So verse 30, it says, "Seeing the wind and the waves, Peter became frightened and he sinks." 31, Jesus reaches down and saves him. But I want us to notice here what Jesus did not do. Okay? Jesus sensed the fear in verse 27, right? Verse 27 says that Jesus sensed the fear, but he did not stop the storm, right? Do we see that? Okay, so he reached down, he pulled Peter up. Verse 32 says that when Jesus got onto the boat, that's when the storm stopped, okay? So when Jesus pulled Peter up, it was still storming. Jesus didn't stop the trial, right? Jesus didn't stop the wind and the waves. No, the storm was still raging. And I think many times when we go through trials, we look to God to pull us out of these trials. We're desperately, "God, I need you to pull me out of these trials." And when he doesn't, it tends to cause some fear and panic in us, right? Like, oh no, there's some serious problems. In this account, Matthew 14, Jesus walking on water, pulling Peter out, a lot of times Christians, we like to focus on how Jesus pulled Peter out of the water, right? Like that gives us the warm and fuzzy, like, hey, we're drowning. Jesus reaches in and he pulls us out of the trial, pulls us out of the problem. And we can't deny it. Christ did that for him, right? Like it's written right there in the scriptures. But what about the disciples that were still in the boat? Like, it wasn't just Peter in the boat, right? Like, what about them? They were still sitting. They were still watching this. They were still thinking. They were still worried. Again, you think about this. It talks in those verses that they had this fear because someone was walking on water. Like, something is walking on top of the water. We're not talking swimming. We're not seeing the little periscope coming up. We're talking something is physically walking on the water. And then it looks at them and says, "Hey, don't be afraid. It's me." Wonderful. Now it's talking to us like, okay, I don't know what for sure this thing is, but it's kind of scary. And then we have Peter standing on the bow like, "Hey guys, who wants to hold my tunic? I'm jumping in." Like, this is like, things are absolutely crazy. If we're looking for a trial, like, this is a trial for them, right? Like how do you even begin to process this? Psalm 23, very familiar, I think, to most Christians around here, and it's viewed as such this positive and this loving psalm. It starts off, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake." Okay, so David paints this absolutely wonderfully beautiful picture where he says that God is our shepherd, we are his sheep, right? God leads us around the end of verse 3. He ends up doing all of this stuff for the sake of his name. We experience the joys, we experience the riches of God so God can get the glory. Sounds like a great thing, right? But David does not just stop there. Like, David continues to go. He paints this beautiful and serene picture, but then David continues to go. He says in Psalm 23, verse 4, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Did anyone catch that in verse 4? He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That means, yeah, I'm walking through it, right? I'm walking through this valley of the shadow of death. Yeah, God, you're with me, but David is walking through that valley, right? And then we get into your rod and your staff, they comfort me. What is with the rod and the staff comforting me? A lot of times we like to look at that and we assume that it's just for Jesus to fight off fight off bad things and to protect us. But boy, the more I read the Bible, I'm not necessarily so sure about that, right? Like the staffs were carried to protect and to guide, but sometimes the staff is applied to the sheep, right? Hebrews 12, who the Lord loves, he disciplines. Okay, so is that staff meant for discipline on me, or is it for protection from something else? And then verse 5, we get to verse 5, tables prepared by God for us in the presence of our enemies. Obviously, I like food, right? Like I enjoy food, but I don't really know if I enjoy sitting at the table in the presence of my enemies and eating with them. I think the thing is that if we'd pull a lot of Christians off to the side and we just secretly one-on-one with them, we talk about these trials, they would say that, well, obviously it sounds terrible. Like it sounds like going through these trials sounds like an absolute painful thing, and it causes so much fear and it causes so much dread inside of us. James 1, chapter 2, flip over to that real quick. Won't be there very, very long, but look at what James has to say about these trials. James says there in verse 2, to consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. You know, the thing is that Christians tend to view trials as such a terrible thing. And I do really want to clear this up. By talking about a trial, I'm not meaning the punishment for your sin. Okay, I'm not talking specifically about punishment that you've incurred upon yourself because you chose to wander from God. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about as a trial. The trial was before you gave into your sin. Okay, that's when the trial was. So I want us to understand. I'm talking about a trial, that this is something that we are facing, that we certainly need the Lord's help to get through. James talks about it as well in verse 3. We read verse 2. Look down to verse 3. He says that the testing of your faith produces endurance, right? Like, it's easy to get bogged down in the trial and lose our focus. This trial is such a bad thing. We start getting distracted. We start losing our sight. We start forgetting that we need to be knowing God and we need to be making him known. So don't let the trial itself distract you, but at the same time, don't let the fear of the trial distract you either. Trials are meant to grow us in the Lord. Trials are not meant to push us from the Lord. So don't let these trials, don't let these thoughts of trials or these fears of trials become a distraction for you. Again, we're talking about distractions. We need to know what we're being distracted from. As Christians, again, our goal is to be knowing God, right? We need to be knowing God. We need to be making him known. If we are distracted, we are not effective at knowing God and making him known. At this time, if the worshipers would come forward and start ministering, I ask now at this time if everyone would bow their head, and I want there to be some serious reflection going on, because again, if we're distracted Christian, we are not an effective Christian. Let it not be said that about the Christians here at New Covenant. Let that not be said about us, that we are just so distracted. Let it not be said that, all we want to do are just use our spiritual gifts and we're forgetting that we are serving God with our spiritual gifts. And again, the spiritual gifts are good things, but remember what Jesus said there in Luke 10, rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. Folks, let's not forget that. Let's not forget that this is what we're working towards. My name is recorded in heaven. That should be such a joyous thing. The second thing that we need to be thinking about, the second distraction that we need to be thinking about, is we really need to be mindful of our preference, right? Like, we don't need to be letting our preference hinder the spreading of the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 12, we read it already. Endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. The last distraction that we need to be mindful of is the fear of trials. There's a lot of we start talking about the end time stuff, and it causes a lot of fear for all of us, but that's not what it's supposed to be about. Pastor Ben preached for the past 4 weeks. It's not what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about that Christ is returning. Christ is getting us. We're spending eternity with the Lord. The trials, okay, that's fine. I remember my name's written in heaven. Right? That's what all of this is about. we really need to examine ourselves. And like I said again, if I'm coming off across as a heartless jerk, please don't take it that way. If we're distracted from God, if we're distracted from knowing God, and we're distracting from making Him known, we aren't serving our role. We aren't serving our purpose. We're not following the Lord. We're not preaching the Lord to the world how we need to. But I say this, if this is one of those things that we're thinking about and we're thinking, well, maybe some changes do need to be made, I ask that you don't sit and just justify the sin that is inside of you, right? Like we take direction, we take this leading as kind of an awful thing of, I can't believe, Kyle's standing up there and saying, my preference isn't important. Let's get ourselves to where we're not hindering the spread of the gospel. Again, not about me, but it's about God. It's about me knowing the Lord and about me spreading the Lord. And I get it. It's very easy to get distracted. All right, but we do need to repent. We do need to turn from these distractions. Finally here, if you are unsaved, this talking about this message here, this is strictly for the Christians. If you're unsaved, I have just one simple question for you, is that if you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was real, would you give your life to Him? Simple question, okay? So I'm talking, this is like common knowledge stuff here. It's common knowledge that the sun gives off light, right? So that same knowledge of saying, if you knew for a fact that God were real, would you give your life to Him? And if you say, well, yeah, Kyle, I actually would, I encourage you, please come find me. Let's talk about this. There's absolutely no shame in this. We all were there at one point. All of us who are professing Christians, we're there at one point where we realized Christ was sufficient for us. Christ was good enough. We need to give our hearts to Him. If you say, well, Kyle, no, I absolutely would not give my life to Him, I still encourage you, come talk to me. I want to know. I want to talk. Let's talk about why. So would you stand with me? Would you bow your heads just as we go to the Lord in prayer? God, I thank you for your word. God, I thank you for the conviction that it brings. God, I thank you that you see the need for everyone to be reached, God, that you love us so much that you are willing to spread the gospel, God, that you are willing to reach out to people, God, and you're willing to send us out to reach them, God. I ask if there's areas, whatever areas in our lives, whether it's something that we've covered now or something specific to each person, any area in our life that is a distraction to you, God, I ask that you convict us of those areas. God, they don't need to be around. All they are doing is hindering the spread of the gospel, God, and that's not what this needs to be about. God, I ask this forgiveness in generals of areas that we have just lost so much sight of you, God, where we chose to not know you, God, and we choose to not make you known, God. I ask for forgiveness during those times, God. That's not how this needs to be. Our job is to serve you, God. Our role is to serve you, God. Our preferences, our desires, our wants, our own selfish thoughts, our own desires for control, God, get in the way and just slow us down so much, God. That's not what this needs to be. We need to make everything in our life strictly be about you, God. We need to make everything in our life to simply be about knowing you, God, and making you known. I ask just moving into this new year, God, there's going to be so many things that are going to be pulling our thoughts from you. There's so many distractions, God, and I ask that we as a collective group of people, God, that we don't get drawn into this, that ultimately, God, you are in control. You establish kings and you control them like the water, God, as you tell us that you assemble whoever you need to fulfill your purpose, God. I ask that we don't get caught up in the mess of all this stuff, God, that our hope still continues to be in you, God, and that our focus are on the hearts of other people, God, that our focus is on ministering for you, God, and spreading the gospel. God, rid us of sin. God, convict us, guide us with your hand. God, we love you. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Folks, I'll be around here. If you guys would like to talk with me, I'll be up at the front.